A billionaire spots a little girl holding a baby in the rain, but what she says next is shocking. The rain was relentless, a symphony of pounding drops and rushing water that transformed Clearwater's cobblestone streets into rivers. Ethan Carter gripped the wheel of his sleek black sedan, his knuckles pale against the leather. The world beyond the windshield was a blur of grey and silver, streaks of light bending through the rain. He barely noticed the red light at the intersection until his car came to a halt. His thoughts were elsewhere, spiraling through the familiar corridors of dissatisfaction. Wealth, accolades, influence. None of it filled the hollow ache that lingered in his chest. Then, emotion caught his eye. A shadow, small and still, pressed against the lamppost on the corner. Ethan squinted through the rain. Not a shadow. A child. The light turned green, but his car didn't move. He stared at the figure, its shape trembling against the deluge. He could make out the outline of thin arms wrapped tightly around something. A bundle. A sibling. Ethan swallowed hard and reached for the door handle. Rain lashed his face as he stepped out, and his coat was soaked before he took 2 steps. As he approached, the child turned, her face pale and eyes wide like an animal caught in headlights. She couldn't have been more than 7, her hair plastered to her head, water dripping down her thin cheeks. In her arms was a baby, silent but shivering under a soaked blanket. "What are you doing out here?" Ethan's voice was firm but gentle, a mix of concern and command. He crouched to her level, trying not to loom over her. The girl's lips quivered. Her grip on the baby tightened. "Go away," she whispered, her voice almost lost in the roar of the storm. "I'm not here to hurt you," Ethan said, his eyes searching hers. "But you can't stay out here. Both of you'll get sick." For a moment, the girl said nothing. Her expression was a mask of defiance, but her trembling hands betrayed her. Ethan's gaze softened, and he tilted his head toward the car. "Come on," he urged. "It's warm, and you'll be safe, I promise." The word hung in the air, and for a moment he thought she might bolt. But then her shoulders sagged, the fight draining out of her. She nodded, just barely, and allowed Ethan to take her by the arm and guide her to the car. Inside, warmth engulfed them, though the girl sat stiffly, her back pressed against the seat, as though preparing to flee. Ethan glanced at her in the rearview mirror as he turned the car toward a small cafe he frequented, run by a woman he trusted. "What's your name?" he asked, keeping his voice light. The girl hesitated, her gaze dropping to the baby in her arms. "Lucy," she murmured. "And him?" Ethan nodded toward the bundle. "Ryan." Her tone was firmer now, protective. "Lucy and Ryan," Ethan repeated, as if testing the names. "I'm Ethan. We're going to a safe place." Lucy didn't respond, her eyes fixed on the baby's face. Ethan didn't press. The rain hammered against the windshield as Ethan drove, the rhythmic patter both soothing and oppressive. Clearwater's streets blurred under the storm, but his hands remained steady on the wheel. Beside him, Lucy sat in silence, her small body dwarfed by the oversized jacket he'd draped around her. Ryan's faint cries came from her arms, muffled but insistent. Ethan kept his eyes on the road, but his mind drifted. The weight in his chest, that familiar ache, had returned with a vengeance the moment he'd seen Lucy huddled under the street lamp. She'd reminded him of someone, or rather, of a memory he'd spent years trying to bury. It had been 7 years since the day his life shattered. Ethan had been at work when the call came, a terse voice on the other end telling him to come home immediately. His wife, Anna, and their 6-year-old daughter, Lily, were gone. The front door had been kicked in, their belongings scattered. The police had swarmed the house, but they'd found nothing. No ransom note, no motive, just an empty home and the haunting silence of absence. For weeks, Ethan had searched, chasing every lead, every whispered rumor. He'd refused to rest, refused to eat, until his body gave out. When the news finally came, it wasn't from the police, but from a stranger who had stumbled upon their bodies in an abandoned warehouse, miles away. The details were blurred now, as though his mind refused to replay them, but the grief was as sharp as ever. Anna and Lily had been killed within hours of being taken. The kidnappers had left no trace, no explanation, and no justice. Ethan had spiraled into a chasm of rage and guilt, his life reduced to a series of hollow days. He'd left his job, sold the house, and drifted to Clearwater, a place where no one knew him, where he could fade into the background. Ethan's grip on the wheel tightened as the memory clawed at him. Lucy shifted slightly beside him, her arms tightening around Ryan. She was so small, her face pale and drawn, but her eyes held something familiar. Fear, yes, but also a quiet determination. It was the same look Lily had worn the last time he'd seen her, on the morning she'd disappeared. He hadn't been there for his daughter. The thought gutted him every time it resurfaced. He'd failed Anna and Lily, and for years he'd told himself he didn't deserve another chance to protect anyone. It was easier to stay distant, to let the world pass him by. But when he'd seen Lucy and Ryan in the rain, something inside him had shifted. He couldn't drive past them, couldn't ignore the desperation in Lucy's eyes, or the way her tiny body had shielded her brother from the cold. They had no one, just as he'd once had no one. The truck rumbled to a stop outside the Helen's Cafe. Ethan killed the engine and turned to Lucy. "Come on," he said gently. "Let's get you inside." A warm glow spilling from the windows onto the wet street. Ethan grabbed an umbrella and hustled the children inside, where the rich aroma of coffee and baked goods greeted them. Helen, a stout woman in her 60s with a no-nonsense air, looked up from the counter. Her brow furrowed when she saw the trio. "Ethan," she said, hurrying over. "What's going on?" "They were out in the rain," Ethan explained briefly. "They need food, dry clothes, and somewhere to rest." Helen didn't ask questions. She ushered them to a corner booth near the fireplace and disappeared into the back. Ethan helped Lucy settle, prying her grip from Ryan just long enough to tuck a blanket around him. Lucy's small hands wrapped around the mug of cocoa Helen brought moments later, though she didn't drink. Ethan watched her closely, noting the way her eyes darted around the room, assessing exits, strangers, and shadows. "Lucy," he began carefully, "where are your parents?" Her gaze snapped to his, sharp and guarded. "Don't have any," she said flatly. Ethan leaned back, his expression neutral. "Who left you out there?" Her fingers tightened on the mug. "The woman from the orphanage," she said finally, her voice barely audible. Ethan frowned. "Why?" Lucy shook her head, tears welling in her eyes, but refusing to fall. "She said she couldn't keep us anymore. We're too much trouble." Helen sucked in a sharp breath from behind the counter, but Ethan remained silent. He nodded once, processing her words. "You're not trouble," he said, quietly, "and we're going to figure this out. Together." Lucy glanced at him, her skepticism clear, but she said nothing. The cafe was a refuge against the storm. The fireplace crackled softly, casting warm orange light on the wooden floors. The faint hum of a radio in the corner blended with the rhythmic patter of rain against the windows. It smelled of coffee, cinnamon, and something faintly nostalgic, perhaps safety, or the illusion of it. Lucy sat on the edge of the worn leather couch, clutching the warm cocoa Helen had handed her. She hadn't taken a sip. Ryan, now bundled in a dry blanket, lay asleep on Helen's lap. His quiet, even breaths seemed to calm the air around them. Ethan leaned against the counter, his arms crossed. He studied Lucy carefully, unsure how to bridge the chasm of silence between them. She didn't look up, her wide, dark eyes fixed on the swirling liquid in her mug. "You're safe here," Ethan said finally. His voice was quiet but firm, as if the words themselves could create a barrier against whatever she was afraid of. "Nobody's going to hurt you." She didn't respond. Her hands tightened around the mug, her knuckles white against the chipped ceramic. Helen glanced at Ethan, her expression soft but urging. He sighed and crouched to Lucy's level, trying to catch her eye. "Lucy," he said gently, "can you tell me what happened? Who left you out there?" Her shoulders tensed. For a moment, Ethan thought she wouldn't answer. Then, in a voice so soft it almost blended with the rain outside, she said, "They didn't want us anymore." Ethan exchanged a glance with Helen. "Who didn't?" he asked, keeping his tone steady. Lucy's fingers traced the rim of the mug. "Miss Reed," she whispered. "She said we were too much trouble. She drove us to the edge of town and told us to get out." Helen inhaled sharply. Ethan felt his jaw tighten. He'd heard of Victoria Reed, the director of Haven for Kids. She was well connected, a name that floated around town charity events. The idea that she could abandon 2 children in the rain like discarded trash was hard to process, but the fear etched into Lucy's face made it impossible to doubt. "She just left you?" Ethan's voice was low, careful not to betray the anger bubbling beneath. Lucy nodded, her small shoulders hunched as though she was bracing for something. "She said no one cares about kids like us anyway." Helen reached over and placed a hand gently on Lucy's. "Well, she's wrong," Helen said firmly. "You're not alone anymore." Lucy looked up for the first time. Her gaze darted between Ethan and Helen, searching their faces as if testing their words. Something softened in her eyes, but the distrust lingered, deeply rooted. Ethan straightened and ran a hand through his damp hair. He felt an unfamiliar weight settle on his chest. Responsibility. He wasn't used to it, not like this. "You're staying with me tonight," he said, his tone leaving no room for argument. "We'll figure everything out in the morning." Lucy hesitated. "What if she comes back?" she asked, her voice trembling. "She won't," Ethan assured her. "Not if I have anything to do with it." Helen gave him a small nod. "I'll come with you," she offered. "It might help them feel safer." Ethan opened his mouth to protest, but closed it again. He wasn't sure he could do this alone. "Thank you," he said, his voice quiet. The drive back to Ethan's house was silent. Lucy sat with Ryan on her lap, her small frame nearly swallowed by Ethan's oversized jacket. The rhythmic motion of the car seemed to lull her into a fragile calm. When they arrived, Ethan led them inside, switching on the warm overhead lights. The house was modest but comfortable, filled with the faint smell of cedar and the clutter of someone who lived alone. Lucy hovered near the doorway, unsure of where to go. Ethan gestured toward the couch. "It's all yours," he said. "Make yourself at home." Lucy nodded and shuffled to the couch, sitting stiffly on the edge. Helen followed, settling Ryan into a makeshift crib Ethan had hastily prepared, with spare blankets. Lucy finally spoke, her voice barely above a whisper. "Thank you." Ethan paused, startled by the unexpected gratitude. "You don't have to thank me," he said. "Just get some rest." As the night deepened, the storm outside began to fade, leaving only the occasional drip of water from the roof. Lucy's eyes grew heavy, her small body sagging against the cushions. Just as sleep claimed her, she murmured words so soft, Ethan almost missed them. "They'll come looking for us." The words lingered in the air long after she drifted off, leaving Ethan staring at the darkened windows, his mind heavy with questions and an unease that refused to settle. The early morning light filtered through the thin curtains in Ethan's living room, casting soft streaks across the cluttered space. The faint scent of coffee lingered in the air, mixing with the earthy aroma of the wooden furniture. Ethan sat by the window, his hands wrapped around a warm mug. Outside, the rain had eased, leaving the world damp and muted. Inside, the house was silent, save for the occasional coo of Ryan waking in his makeshift crib. Ethan's gaze wandered to Lucy, sitting cross-legged on the carpet. Her small hands moved deftly, folding and refolding Ryan's blanket with meticulous care. Her movements were almost mechanical, precise, as though following an invisible set of rules ingrained into her by necessity. "They'll come looking for us." The words lingered in the air long after she drifted off, leaving Ethan staring at the darkened windows, his mind heavy with questions and an unease that refused to settle. The early morning light filtered through the thin curtains in Ethan's living room, casting soft streaks across the cluttered space. The faint scent of coffee lingered in the air, mixing with the earthy aroma of the wooden furniture. Ethan sat by the window, his hands wrapped around a warm mug. Outside, the rain had eased, leaving the world damp and muted. Inside, the house was silent, save for the occasional coo of Ryan waking in his makeshift crib. Ethan's gaze wandered to Lucy, sitting cross-legged on the carpet. Her small hands moved deftly, folding and refolding Ryan's blanket with meticulous care. Her movements were almost mechanical, precise, as though following an invisible set of rules ingrained into her by necessity. She didn't look up, her focus unwavering, her expression unreadable. Ethan noted the care she took to ensure every fold was just right, the way her tiny shoulders tensed at the faintest noise. The girl had a quiet strength about her, but it was laced with fragility, like a glass figurine balanced on the edge of a shelf. Ethan leaned back, watching her in silence. For a child her age, her every movement carried an air of practiced responsibility, as though she'd long abandoned the luxury of being cared for. He sipped his coffee, the bitterness grounding him. It was odd, having someone else in the house. His home was a sanctuary of solitude, filled with relics of a life he wasn't sure he wanted anymore. A cracked photo frame sat on the mantel, holding an image of a younger, more hopeful Ethan, standing beside a woman whose face he could no longer look at without a pang of regret. Lucy glanced up briefly, catching Ethan's gaze. Her dark eyes flicked away just as quickly, wary but curious. She finished folding the blanket and adjusted Ryan's position in the crib, her movements deliberate and gentle. Ethan opened his mouth to speak, but stopped himself. What could he say to a child who'd likely heard more empty promises than words of comfort? Instead, he set his mug down and stood. "You hungry?" he asked, his voice casual. Lucy hesitated before nodding. "For Ryan too," she added, her tone quiet but firm. Ethan smiled faintly. "We'll make something for both of you." The sound of eggs sizzling in the pan filled the kitchen, a stark contrast to the silence that had blanketed the house. Helen had left earlier, promising to return later with supplies for the kids. As Ethan worked, his mind turned to the name Lucy had mentioned the night before. Victoria Reed. He'd heard whispers about her, the way one hears faint rumors of something not quite right. Still, the extent of her cruelty Abandoning children in the cold seemed almost inconceivable. Once Lucy and Ryan were fed, Ethan retreated to his study. The room was cramped, lined with shelves overflowing with books and papers. He flipped open his old phone, his fingers hovering over the contacts. Finally, he selected the name he hadn't called in months: John Harris. "Carter," John's gruff voice answered after a few rings. "Didn't think I'd hear from you." "Morning, John. I need your help," Ethan said, keeping his voice level. "It's about Haven for Kids. Do you know anything about Victoria Reed?" There was a pause on the other end. "Why are you asking?" "I found 2 kids last night," Ethan explained. "Lucy and her baby brother, Ryan. She says Reed left them out in the rain, told them no one cared about kids like them." John let out a low whistle. "That's a hell of an accusation. But you know Reed's got friends in high places, people who won't take kindly to you poking around. Friends or not, she abandoned them," Ethan pressed, "and I'm not letting this go." There was a long silence. "I'll see what I can find," John said finally. "But keep your head down, Carter. You don't want to stir up trouble unless you're ready for what comes with it." The line went dead, leaving Ethan staring at the phone. He clenched it tightly before setting it on the desk. Trouble was coming whether he was ready or not. Back in the living room, Lucy had settled into a corner with a picture book Helen had brought the night before. She wasn't reading it. Her eyes were distant, unfocused, as though caught in some internal struggle. When Ethan sat beside her, she stiffened slightly, but didn't move away. "You did good taking care of Ryan," he said after a moment. "He's lucky to have you." Lucy didn't respond right away. Her fingers traced the edge of the book. "It's just what I have to do," she said simply. "He doesn't have anyone else." The weight of her words settled heavily between them. Ethan looked at her, this small girl who had been forced to grow up too fast. He wanted to say something, anything, to reassure her, but the words felt hollow. The morning sun barely lit the overcast sky as Ethan parked his truck in front of Clearwater's records office. The modest brick building seemed unassuming, its exterior betraying nothing of the secrets it might hold. Ethan stepped inside, greeted by the musty scent of old paper and faintly humming fluorescent lights. The clerk, a middle-aged woman with wire-rimmed glasses, looked up from her desk. "Can I help you?" "I'm looking for historical records on Haven for Kids," Ethan said, his voice steady. "Anything about its founding and operations." Her brow furrowed slightly. "That's an unusual request. What's this about?" "Just trying to understand its history," he replied vaguely. "It's important." She studied him for a moment before nodding. "Follow me." Ethan was led into a narrow room lined with metal filing cabinets. The clerk pointed to a stack of boxes labeled Haven for Kids and left him to his work. He settled into the lone chair at the center table, opened the first box, and began sifting through files. The early records painted a picture of hope. The orphanage had been founded decades ago by Margaret Holloway, a local philanthropist. Photos of bright-eyed children playing in sunlit courtyards filled the pages, accompanied by articles lauding Holloway's dedication. It was a safe haven, a place meant to nurture. But as Ethan worked his way through the files, the tone shifted. Margaret's death 10 years prior marked the beginning of a slow decline. Victoria Reed, a woman with no prior experience in child welfare, had assumed leadership shortly after. A folder of financial records revealed sharp budget cuts, staff turnover, and a steady influx of private donations with unclear origins. The photos became sparse, the children's smiles faded. Ethan paused on one photo. It showed Victoria, standing in front of the orphanage with a local politician, her tight-lipped smile a stark contrast to the joy that had radiated from Margaret's images. He couldn't pinpoint why, but something about her gaze unsettled him, cold, calculating, as if she saw those around her not as people, but as assets. A sudden chill prickled at the back of his neck. He glanced at the door, half expecting someone to be watching, but the room was empty. Shaking off the feeling, he flipped through the Methothores, the Kansei. It's de Horaces. Meng, hing Fidesi, Queen Files, jotting down notes and snapping photos with his phone. Back at Ethan's house, Helen sat across from Lucy, who was fiddling with a corner of the tablecloth. Ryan lay asleep in his crib, his soft breaths the only sound filling the room. "You don't have to talk if you're not ready," Helen said gently. "But if there's anything you want to share, I'm here to listen." Lucy's fingers stilled. For a long moment, she was silent, her gaze fixed on the table. Then, in a voice barely above a whisper, she said, "At night, it got really quiet." Helen tilted her head slightly, encouraging her to continue. "Too quiet," Lucy added, her voice trembling. "Sometimes kids would just disappear. They'd be there one day, gone the next. Miss Reed would tell us they found homes, but no one ever came to say goodbye. It didn't feel right." Helen's heart clenched. "That must have been scary." Lucy nodded, her hands gripping the edge of her chair. "We weren't allowed to ask questions. If you did, she'd get angry. Real angry." Before Helen could respond, Ethan stepped through the door, his expression grim. He handed her a small stack of photocopied documents. "It's worse than I thought," he said. "The place went downhill fast after Reed took over. There's something off about her, about all of it." Helen glanced at Lucy, who had curled into herself, her small frame almost disappearing into the chair. Ethan caught her eye and nodded, understanding the unspoken plea to tread carefully. That evening, Ethan sat in his study, the table cluttered with the records he'd brought home. His phone buzzed. It was John. "I found someone who used to work at Haven," John said. "Jacob Simmons. He was let go a few years back after trying to blow the whistle on Reed." "Where is he now?" Ethan asked. "Hiding," John replied. "He's terrified of what Reed might do if he talks." Ethan frowned. "Can you get me his contact information?" "I'll try," John said. "But be careful, Carter. You're already on thin ice." After hanging up, Ethan staring at the files spread before him. The pieces were starting to fit together, but the picture they formed was dark and foreboding. As the night deepened, Ethan made his rounds through the house, checking on the children. Lucy was asleep on the couch, one hand resting protectively on Ryan's crib. Ethan adjusted the blanket around her shoulders before turning toward the window. Movement outside caught his eye. A figure lingered near the edge of his property, just beyond the reach of the porch light. Ethan's pulse quickened. He grabbed the flashlight by the door and stepped onto the porch, the beam cutting through the darkness. But by the time the light hit the spot, the figure was gone. Ethan stood there for a moment, the cold air biting at his skin, the sense of unease settling deeper in his chest. The road to the cabin wound through a dense forest, the tall evergreens forming a canopy that blocked much of the morning light. Ethan navigated the rough path with care, his hands tight on the steering wheel. The air was damp and heavy, the silence broken only by the crunch of gravel beneath the truck's tires. When the cabin came into view, Ethan slowed. It was small, almost dilapidated, nestled against a backdrop of trees, so thick they seemed to swallow the structure whole. A faint curl of smoke rose from the chimney, suggesting someone was inside. He parked the truck and stepped out, glancing around. The quiet was unsettling. He approached the door and knocked, the sound echoing in the stillness. A moment later, the door creaked open a fraction, revealing a gaunt man with bloodshot eyes. Jacob Simmons. His face was pale, his beard unkempt, and his hands fidgeted with the edge of the doorframe. "You, Carter!" Jacob's voice was hoarse, barely above a whisper. Ethan nodded. "John Harris sent me. Said you could help." Jacob glanced past Ethan, his eyes darting to the shadows of the trees. "You followed?" "No," Ethan replied firmly. "I came alone." After a tense pause, Jacob opened the door wider. "Come in, but keep it quiet." The cabin's interior was dimly lit, the air thick with the smell of damp wood and smoke from a smoldering fire. Jacob motioned for Ethan to sit at the rickety table in the center of the room. The man's nervous energy was palpable. His fingers tapped incessantly on the tabletop, and his eyes flickered to every creak and groan of the cabin. "You have no idea what you're messing with," Jacob muttered, dropping into the chair opposite Ethan. He rubbed his temples, his hands trembling. "Reed's got people everywhere. If they know I'm talking to you, I'm dead." "Then why agree to this?" Ethan asked, his voice calm but firm. "You could have said no." Jacob laughed bitterly. "Because someone needs to know the truth before it's too late." Ethan leaned forward. "Tell me everything." Jacob hesitated, his gaze fixed on his trembling hands. Finally he spoke, his voice barely above a whisper. "When I worked at Haven, things were wrong. Kids disappearing, records vanishing. Reed was in charge of all of it. She'd forge adoption papers, make it look legit. But those kids, they weren't being adopted. They were being sold." Ethan's stomach turned. "Sold?" "To the highest bidder," Jacob said grimly. "We're talking about people with money and power. She'd ship them off, and no one ever asked questions. She's got connections, politicians, businessmen, law enforcement. They protect her because she's useful." Ethan let the weight of Jacob's words settle. "Why didn't you go to the authorities?" Jacob let out a hollow laugh. "I did. You think they cared? Reed found out I'd talked. Next thing I know, I'm fired, blacklisted and scared for my life. They made it clear. If I didn't keep my mouth shut, I wouldn't live long enough to regret it." Ethan's jaw tightened. "You've been hiding ever since." Jacob nodded, his eyes haunted. "I didn't have a choice." Ethan reached into his pocket and pulled out his phone, showing Jacob a picture of Lucy and Ryan. "These kids need someone to speak up for them. Reed left them to die in the rain because she thought no one would care. If we don't stop her, how many more will she hurt?" Jacob stared at the screen, his expression softening. For a moment, the fear in his eyes was replaced by something else. Guilt, perhaps, or resolve. He exhaled shakily. "I'll help, but only if you promise to keep my name out of it. I'm not ready to die." "I'll do whatever it takes to protect you," Ethan said, his voice steady. "But we need your testimony. We need evidence." Jacob hesitated, then nodded. "There's a storage unit. Reed keeps her real records there, stuff she doesn't want anyone finding. It's the only proof you'll get." "Where is it?" Ethan pressed. Jacob scribbled an address on a scrap of paper and handed it over. "Be careful," he warned. "If she catches wind of this, she won't just come after me. She'll come after you too." The drive back to Ethan's house was uneventful, but his mind raced with everything Jacob had revealed. The stakes were higher than he'd anticipated, and the danger was becoming more tangible with each step. As he pulled into his driveway, something caught his attention. A folded piece of paper was pinned to his front door with a knife. His heart sank as he approached, the note fluttering slightly in the breeze. In bold, scrawled handwriting, it read, "Stay out of this, Carter." Ethan's grip tightened on the paper, his pulse pounding in his ears. The message was clear, but it only steeled his resolve. Whoever had left the note underestimated him. He wasn't backing down. Not now. The diner was nearly empty, its fluorescent lights casting a sterile glow over the checkered floors. The faint clink of dishes came from the kitchen, and the muted hum of a jukebox filled the silence. Ethan sat in a corner booth, nursing a cup of coffee that had long since gone cold. Across from him, John Harris leaned back, his broad shoulders almost filling the small space. His expression was skeptical, his fingers drumming against the table. "You're telling me she's selling kids?" John's voice was low, cautious, but there was an edge to it. "That's a big claim, Carter. One that could blow up in both our faces if you're wrong. It's not just about stopping her," Ethan said after a moment. "It's about those kids. Lucy, Ryan. They deserve a chance. If I don't do this, who will?" John studied him for a long moment, his usual gruffness softening slightly. "This about them, or is it about you?" Ethan's jaw tightened. He hesitated, then spoke, his voice quieter. "Maybe both. I've spent years trying to outrun the past, John. I can't do it anymore, not when it means turning my back on them." John didn't push further. Instead, he nodded slowly. "All right. I'll see what I can dig up on this storage unit. But you need to be ready for pushback. Real pushback. These people don't play fair." Ethan gave a small nod, the weight of the conversation settling over him. "Thanks, John." "Don't thank me yet," John muttered, standing. "This is just the start." Back at the house, Helen sat on the living room floor with Lucy, a stack of picture books between them. Lucy's small hands carefully turned the pages, her expression focused as she traced the illustrations with her fingers. Ryan slept peacefully in his crib nearby, his soft breaths filling the quiet room. "You know," Helen began, her tone light, "when I was your age, I used to get scared a lot too." Lucy glanced up, her dark eyes curious but guarded. "What were you scared of?" Helen smiled faintly, her hands resting on her knees. "Lots of things. Big ones, small ones. But the worst was feeling alone, like no one would be there if things got bad." Lucy's fingers stilled on the page. "What did you do?" "I found people who cared," Helen said softly. "Sometimes it took a while, but they were there. And you know what? I learned it's okay to let them in. Even when it's scary." Lucy didn't respond, but her gaze lingered on Helen a moment longer before returning to the book. Later that evening, Ethan sat alone in his study, the dim light of the desk lamp illuminating the scattered documents before him. He sifted through them mechanically, his mind elsewhere. The faded edges of a photograph caught his eye. Hesitating, he picked it up. The photo showed a young girl, her face bright with laughter as she stood beside a much younger Ethan. Her hair was pulled back in a messy ponytail, her arms wrapped around a scruffy dog. Ethan's throat tightened as memories he'd tried to bury resurfaced. The door creaked slightly, and Ethan looked up. Lucy stood there, her small frame outlined by the hallway light. Her eyes darted to the photo, curiosity flickering across her face, but she didn't ask. "Couldn't sleep?" Ethan asked, setting the photo down. Lucy shook her head. "Just wanted to check on Ryan." Ethan nodded. "He's fine. Helen's with him." Lucy lingered in the doorway for a moment before retreating silently. Ethan watched her go, the weight of the photo still heavy in his hand. Victoria Reed stood by the floor-to-ceiling window of her sprawling estate, her sharp eyes scanning the manicured gardens below. The house was a monument to her success, or rather, the success she had carefully constructed through decades of ruthless manipulation. Crystal chandeliers adorned high ceilings, and priceless artworks lined the walls. But tonight, the opulence offered her no comfort. She held a tumbler of whiskey, her fingers tightening around the glass as she reviewed the latest updates. "Are you certain?" she asked, her voice crisp and devoid of emotion. "Yes, ma'am." A man in a tailored suit stood behind her, his tone measured but laced with unease. "There's been activity. A man named Ethan Carter, former contractor, mid-level nobody, has been digging into Haven for kids. He's spoken to Jacob Simmons." Victoria's lips pressed into a thin line. Simmons should have been dealt with years ago. How has he managed to stay hidden? The man shifted uncomfortably. He's careful, and it seems Carter has been offering him protection. Victoria turned, her movements precise and deliberate. Her gaze bore into him, and he felt an involuntary shiver. Carter. What else do we know? He's working with Harris, but so far they're moving cautiously. No formal complaints, just poking around. Victoria's jaw tightened imperceptibly. She moved to the desk at the center of the room, sliding into the leather chair. The whiskey glass landed on the surface with a soft thunk as she leaned forward. "Carter is a problem," she said finally, "and problems need to be solved before they grow. What about our assets in the department?" The man hesitated. "Deputy Weston has been briefed. He's agreed to stall Harris if needed. But, ma'am, Carter is persistent. If he gets too close—" "He won't," Victoria interrupted, her tone brooking no argument. "He doesn't understand the scale of what he's up against." Her fingers tapped against the desk, her mind already spinning a web of contingency plans. Victoria thrived in control, and this was no different. She had weathered storms before, nosy journalists, whistleblowers, even law enforcement. They had all underestimated her reach, and Carter would be no exception. "Have Weston send a message," she said, "something subtle but clear, and watch Simmons closely. If he shows any sign of turning, we'll handle it." The man nodded, relief mingling with apprehension. "Understood." As he left the room, Victoria stared at the shadows beyond the window. The night felt heavier than usual, the darkness pressing in around her estate. She took a slow sip of her drink, her mind coldly calculating the next moves. Meanwhile, on the outskirts of Clearwater, Ethan and John sat in Ethan's truck, parked discreetly near a wooded area. The orphanage loomed in the distance, its faint outline visible under the pale glow of a security light. The silence was oppressive, broken only by the occasional rustle of leaves in the wind. "Unmarked vans," John muttered, pointing toward the driveway. "Two of them. That's the third time this week." Ethan's jaw tightened as he followed John's gaze. The vans were plain, with no logos or identifying features. They disappeared into the night, heading toward the highway. "Jacob said they're shipments," Ethan said, his voice low. "Kids being sent off to God knows where." John exhaled sharply. "We need to get closer. Get plates. Anything we can use." Ethan glanced at him, his expression hard. "And what happens when Weston finds out we've been snooping around? You trust him not to tip off Reed?" John's silence spoke volumes. They both knew Weston was compromised, but without concrete evidence, they couldn't move against him. It was a dangerous game, and the stakes were higher than either of them had anticipated. Back at the estate, Victoria paced the length of her study, her heels clicking against the marble floor. She had just gotten off a call with Deputy Weston, and the information he'd provided had been concerning. "Carter's persistence is admirable," she mused aloud, "but misplaced." A woman in her late 30s entered the room, her expression as sharp as her tailored suit. Do you want me to handle him? Victoria raised an eyebrow. And draw more attention? No. Carter's a fly. Annoying, but easily swatted. For now, we remind him of his place. The woman nodded, her lips curving into a faint smirk. Understood. Later that night, Ethan returned home, exhaustion weighing heavily on him. He parked the truck and stepped onto the porch, pausing when he noticed something out of place. A faint, metallic glint caught his eye, and his stomach sank. Pinned to the wooden beam was a small envelope, a single nail driven through it. Ethan pulled it free, his hands steady despite the dread creeping up his spine. He unfolded the paper inside. The message was simple, but chilling. Last warning, stop digging. Ethan stared at the words, his mind racing. He looked out into the darkened street, scanning for any sign of movement, but the night was eerily still. Ethan's study was a mess of papers, photographs, and hastily scrawled notes. The faint glow of the desk lamp illuminated his furrowed brow as he pieced together the final puzzle. The file he held trembled slightly in his hands, a combination of adrenaline and exhaustion. This was it. The evidence he had been chasing for weeks. Proof undeniable. He stared at the photograph clipped to the front of the file, a grainy image taken from Jacob Simmons' tip-off about the storage unit. It showed shelves lined with meticulously kept records, adoption forms with false names, payment receipts tied to offshore accounts, and, most damning of all, a list of clients, wealthy individuals spanning politics, business, and law enforcement. Among the names was Deputy Weston. A sharp knock at the door jolted him from his thoughts. He turned, instinctively tensing, but Helen's familiar voice came from the other side. "Ethan, are you all right?" He opened the door, and Helen stepped in, her eyes scanning the chaos around them. "What is all this?" "Everything we need," Ethan replied, his voice edged with determination. "It's all here. Proof of what Reed's been doing, who she's working with, and where those kids are being sent." Helen's face paled as she picked up a sheet detailing one of the falsified adoptions. This is horrifying. What are you going to do?" "I'm meeting Harris," Ethan said, already packing the documents into a weathered leather satchel. "We're taking this to the station. This ends now." Helen placed a hand on his arm, her eyes filled with concern. "Ethan, if you take this to the police, Weston will find out. Reed will find out. You're putting a target on yourself." "I know," Ethan said, his voice steady. "But if we don't act now, more kids will disappear. I can't live with that." Helen hesitated, then nodded, her hand dropping to her side. "Be careful. And thank you for fighting for them." Ethan gave a faint smile, gratitude flickering in his eyes before he turned back to his preparations. He carefully secured the satchel, grabbed his coat, and headed for the door. "I'll be back as soon as I can." John Harris was waiting at a quiet diner on the outskirts of Clearwater. The air inside was thick with the smell of stale coffee and fried food. Ethan slid into the booth across from him, the satchel placed firmly on the table. "Is this it?" Harris asked, his voice low but urgent. "This is it," Ethan replied, opening the bag and laying out the contents. "Everything Jacob gave me, plus what I found at the storage unit. It's all here. Names, transactions, even the shipping routes." Harris leaned forward, his eyes scanning the documents. His expression darkened as he flipped through the pages. "Damn it, Carter. This is bigger than I thought." "It's not just Reed," Ethan said. "She's part of a network. We've got one chance to take her down, and we can't afford to miss." Harris nodded, his jaw tight. "We'll need a team. People we can trust. No leaks, no screw-ups. If Weston catches wind of this, we're done. Ethan's voice hardened. Then, we make sure he doesn't. By the time they arrived at the police station, the plan was already forming. Harris pulled together a handful of officers he knew were clean, men and women who had no ties to Reed's circle of influence. In a small, windowless briefing room, they pored over the evidence Ethan had brought. "This is it," Harris said, addressing the group. "We have a limited window to act. These vans leave the orphanage late at night, headed for distribution points we've mapped out. Tonight we intercept them. We take Reed down and we dismantle her operation." A young officer raised her hand. "What about Deputy Weston? If he's involved, won't he try to stop us?" Harris's eyes darkened. "Weston doesn't know about this, and if he tries anything, he'll answer to me." The room fell silent, the weight of the mission settling over them. Ethan stepped forward, his voice steady. "This isn't just about stopping Reed. It's about saving those kids. We can't let them down." The officers nodded, their resolve visible in their expressions. As the team finalized their preparations, Ethan slipped away to make a call. Lucy's voice answered on the second ring. "Ethan?" "Hey, kid," he said softly. "I just wanted to check in. How's Ryan?" "He's fine," Lucy replied. "Helen's making him laugh. She's good at that." Ethan smiled faintly, the tension in his shoulders easing for a moment. "Listen, I might be late tonight, but don't worry, okay? I'll be back." Lucy was quiet for a moment. "You're going after Miss Reed, aren't you?" Ethan hesitated, then said, "Yeah, I am." "Be careful," she said, her voice small but earnest. "She's dangerous." "I will," Ethan promised. "You just take care of Ryan and Helen for me, all right?" "All right." The sun had set by the time Ethan returned to the station. The team was assembled, their gear packed, their expressions steeled for what lay ahead. Harris clapped a hand on Ethan's shoulder. "Ready?" "As I'll ever be," Ethan replied. The two men exchanged a nod before Harris addressed the team. "Let's move. We've got one shot at this." As the group filed out into the night, the weight of the mission pressed down on Ethan. He glanced at the satchel in Harris's hand. His work, his proof, his responsibility. Whatever happened next, there was no turning back. The forest surrounding Clearwater was unnervingly silent that night, its towering trees casting long skeletal shadows under the pale moonlight. Ethan tightened his grip on the steering wheel, glancing at John beside him. Behind them, two other vehicles followed, trusted allies who had quietly joined their mission after John pulled a few strings. "Are we ready for this?" John asked, his voice low, almost drowned by the hum of the engine. Ethan nodded, his expression set with quiet determination. "We don't have a choice." The van came into view just after midnight, its headlights cutting through the mist that clung to the road like a ghostly veil. Ethan signaled to the other vehicles, pulling off the road at a bend that forced the van to slow. As the van approached, John stepped into the middle of the road, flashlight raised. The driver slammed the brakes, the van screeching to a halt mere feet from where John stood. Ethan and the others emerged from the shadows surrounding the vehicle. "Step out," John ordered, his voice steady but firm. The driver hesitated, his hand twitching toward the dashboard. Ethan stepped forward, the beam of his flashlight steady on the man's face. "Don't," he warned. Slowly, the driver and his passenger exited, their hands raised. Ethan's team worked quickly, securing the men and prying open the van's rear doors. Inside, the air was thick with a sickly staleness. Crates lined the walls, but it was the figures huddled in the center that drew Ethan's breath short. Children. They ranged in age, the oldest perhaps 10, their wide eyes reflecting a mixture of fear and exhaustion. A small girl clutched a tattered blanket, her lip trembling as she tried to stifle a sob. Ethan's chest tightened. "It's okay," he said softly, stepping inside. "We're here to help." The girl flinched at first, but relaxed slightly as he crouched to her level. "We're going to get you out of here," he promised. The operation moved swiftly. The children were transferred to one of the other vehicles, where Helen waited to comfort them. Ethan stayed back, sifting through the contents of the crates for anything that could tie Victoria Reed directly to this transport. He found it in a battered ledger tucked inside one of the crates. The pages were filled with names, dates, and destinations, evidence that pointed far beyond Clearwater. Each entry was a chilling reminder of how many lives had been affected. John appeared at Ethan's side, glancing at the ledger. "This is bigger than I thought," he muttered. Ethan closed the book, his jaw set. "It's not just her. There are others. We have to stop this." John nodded, though his expression was grim. "We need to move. This won't go unnoticed for long." The ride back to Clearwater was tense, the weight of what they'd uncovered pressing heavily on everyone. At Ethan's house, the children were ushered inside, their fragile forms looking even smaller against the backdrop of the dimly lit living room. Helen worked quickly, wrapping each child in blankets and offering warm drinks. Her calm, reassuring demeanor was a balm against the chaos of the night. Lucy sat beside one of the rescued girls, holding her hand. The girl whispered something in Lucy's ear, her voice barely audible. Lucy's eyes widened, her face pale in the low light. She turned to Ethan, her voice trembling. "She said there's a basement under the orphanage. That's where they keep the others." Ethan froze. The words hung in the air, heavy with implications. He looked at John, who met his gaze with a grim nod. "That changes everything," John said. Ethan turned back to Lucy. "Are you sure that's what she said?" Lucy nodded. "She said they only bring some kids out. The others stay there." Ethan's mind raced. The ledger, the shipments, the missing children. It all pointed to something darker and far more dangerous than he'd imagined. Whatever lay beneath Haven for Kids was the key to uncovering the full scope of Victoria's operation. But getting there wouldn't be easy. As the night wore on, Ethan retreated to his study, the ledger open before him. Each name on the page felt like a silent plea for justice. The night was darker than usual as Ethan, John, and their team approached Haven for Kids. Their vehicles crept along the outskirts of the orphanage, headlights off, relying on the faint glow of moonlight filtering through the thick clouds. The building loomed in the distance, its exterior eerily quiet. But now, they knew what lay beneath. Ethan adjusted the strap of his pack, his fingers brushing the edge of the flashlight clipped to his belt. Beside him, John whispered, "We have one shot at this. If Reed catches wind, we're here, it's over." Ethan nodded, his jaw tight. "Then we make it count." The team split into two groups. Ethan and John approached the back of the orphanage, where the loading dock offered a less conspicuous entry point. The others stayed near the perimeter, their eyes scanning the area for any signs of trouble. The air inside was stale, tinged with the faint metallic scent of rust. Ethan's boots echoed softly on the concrete floor as they moved through the building. The orphanage seemed deserted, its halls lifeless. But as they reached the basement stairs, the hum of machinery and muffled voices broke the silence. Ethan gestured for John to follow, their footsteps careful on the metal staircase. At the bottom, a locked steel door barred their way. John crouched, pulling out a small toolkit. Within seconds, the lock clicked open, and the door swung inward. What they saw stopped them cold. The basement was a stark contrast to the neglected halls above. Bright fluorescent lights illuminated rows of metal cages, each one barely large enough to fit a child. Some were empty, while others held children curled up against the bars, their faces pale and gaunt. Ethan's stomach churned as he counted them, far fewer than he'd hoped, but each one a life that needed saving. A sharp voice cut through the air. "You shouldn't be here." Ethan turned to see Victoria Reed standing at the far end of the room, flanked by two armed men. Her tailored suit was immaculate, her expression a mask of cold confidence. "I warned you, Carter," she said, her tone icy. "But you just couldn't leave it alone." Victoria backed away, her heels clicking against the floor as she tried to retreat. Ethan caught up with her, blocking her path. "It's over," he said, his voice low. Her defiance crumbled, replaced by something uglier, desperation. "You'll never win," she hissed. "You think taking me down will change anything? They'll replace me before you even leave this building." "Then we'll take them down too," Ethan replied. As the team worked to free the children, Ethan found a small office tucked into the corner of the basement. Inside, rows of filing cabinets held meticulously organized records, falsified adoption papers, financial transactions, and a map detailing the network's operations. It was the smoking gun they needed. He stuffed as much as he could into his pack before returning to the main room. The children were being carried out, their quiet sobs a haunting soundtrack to the night. One little boy clung to Ethan's jacket, his wide eyes filled with gratitude and fear. By dawn, the police had arrived, taking Victoria and her remaining guards into custody. The children were loaded into ambulances, their futures uncertain, but no longer in Reed's hands. As Victoria was led away in handcuffs, she glared at Ethan, her voice a venomous whisper. "This isn't over!" Ethan didn't flinch. "No," he said. "It's not." The following days were a blur of debriefings and legal proceedings. The documents from the basement provided irrefutable evidence, linking Reed to a sprawling trafficking ring that extended far beyond Clearwater. But for Ethan, the fight was personal. He began the process of legally adopting Lucy and Ryan, determined to give them the stability they deserved. One evening, as the house settled into a peaceful quiet, Ethan sat by the fireplace with Lucy on his lap. Ryan lay asleep in the crib nearby, his tiny breaths a soothing rhythm. In Ethan's hands was a worn storybook, its pages creased and well-loved. Lucy leaned against him, her voice soft. "Can you read it again?" Ethan smiled, turning to the first page. As he read, the tension that had gripped him for weeks began to ease. Lucy's cautious smile grew as she listened, her small hand clutching his shirt. For the first time in years, Ethan felt something he thought he'd lost. Hope. The shadows of the past still lingered, but in that moment, they didn't matter.